Hello, welcome again to Sport Unlocked, going through all the week's sports news with me, Rob Harris from Sky News, Martyn Ziegler from The Times and Tariq Panja from The New York Times. Well, let's start again with where everyone's been on their travels. Tariq, you've gone the furthest, out to Switzerland, although not a glamorous trip some might think of. What was it?
Yep, the World Anti-Doping Agency annual symposium in Lausanne. Interesting place to be just a few months before the Olympics. And Lausanne is, I guess, the home of a lot of these international sports bodies. And Thomas Bach, the IOC president, was there, so we can talk about that a little bit more later on.
Your trip to Lausanne meant you weren't there for the UEFA briefing that was held in London this week. And in fact, they're asking where you were after spending time, particularly on the pod, asking for more briefings. So I was having to make excuses for you, but I was there along with Martyn. It was, 2 hours to explain the new formats for the men's competitions. Not the simplest.
No, I think that's been the challenge, isn't it, for UEFA, that they're a bit worried that fans won't understand this new concept. 36 teams in a single table, and then goes down into a knockout round of the last 16. I think the most interesting.
And you've missed one stage out as well, even from that as well. Such the format.
Go on.
The playoffs.
Teams 1 to 8 qualify automatically for the last 16. Teams 9 to 24 have to play an extra playoff round to get into the round of 16.
They're going to have tennis-style seedings for the round of 16 onwards. So the top two clubs who finish top of the 36-team league table, they will be kept on separate halves of the draw, so they can't meet to the final. So a bit like if you have Rafa, Nadal and Djokovic, they're always kept part of the final if they're seeded 1 and 2. The same thing will happen. And then all the top 8 teams will be seeded. So certainly initially they will be kept apart.
Yeah, and the thing I found interesting, in addition to that, reading from far away, was it's quite complex, so complex that we're not going to have a traditional draw, are we, for the opening stage?
No, they worked out if they'll do a completely manual draw, it could take 3 to 4 hours. Imagine that as a TV show. Well, perhaps the host would get paid a bit more if they're going to be that long on stage. But the reason is because that new group stage from the single league table, teams are going to play 8 rather than 6 games. They're going to play 8 different opponents. And how that will work is you'll get 2 from each pot. So it does mean that a top team will play 2 other star teams, which is all their attempt to sort of counter the Super League, isn't it? To get more big matches against big opponents.
So no more claims of hot and cold balls, lads.
I did start to think about things like Dominion voting systems. Think of the last US election, people raising issues with electronic systems. Will they claim the computers have fixed it and things like that for a particular team? It's not like certain clubs are shying away from claiming conspiracy at times.
No, they did say they're going to be audited by Ernst & Young, so to ensure that there's no sort of manipulation of the computer system. But yes, to go back, if they'd done the manual draw, they would have had to use 900 separate balls to be drawn in containing the names. So not surprisingly, they've had to ditch that. I do think the new system, and if you compared to what I think is a fairly stale group stage now. For example, they did a simulation of what Manchester City's draw could have looked like, and their 8 opponents, it could have been Paris Saint-Germain, Bayern Munich, Real Madrid, Leipzig, AC Milan, Red Star, Belgrade, Young Boys and Galatasaray. So some really sort of mouth-watering matches there, which I suppose answers the question about trying to get some of those big matches earlier in the tournament.
There was something else intriguingly floated by the UEFA General Secretary, Theodoridis. He did say that they're looking at an option where the top seeded sides would get to choose their opposition in the last 16, like a draft.
Theodoridis did this as a sort of way out idea, which he thought would be loved by the broadcasters, where you could choose your opponent. The captains and the coaches would have 30 seconds to choose their opponent, starting off with the top seeds and then going down. It would have been great to see, but I think it would have been too controversial. So not surprisingly, he was given short shrift.
This does all sound a bit like, in part, the plan. I think I mentioned it on the pod before, how leagues, whether it's the Premier League, should do their fixture announcements, which is you draw the opening round and then the computer does the rest of it, but it means you create a sort of midsummer event.
Yeah, so is that what's going to happen here? Is there going to be a draw of any kind in this new competition? Is there going to be an event?
Yeah, same as before. They'll have what they'll do. They'll just draw out one club name, and they won't draw out the opponent. So they'll pull out Arsenal if they're in the Champions League, and then they will then get the computer whirring, and it'll spit out their 8 opponents, and then they'll pick out the next club and then do the same.
You mentioned Arsenal. The Champions League now is something heavily promoted by FIFA, of course, because the winners feed into the Club World Cup. And I think this is, of course, Arsenal's last way of joining the Club World Cup next year if they do win the Champions League. But we keep on discovering new opponents, don't we? Borussia Dortmund qualifying this week.
I think Juventus also qualified this week.
Yes, that's interesting because, of course, they're banned, aren't they, from Europe this season? Yet they have qualified.
Is that because of a UEFA seeding situation? Or?
I think it's on the fact of their coefficient, that they are sort of guaranteed to have the highest coefficient of the teams that are available. Is that right, Rob?
Yeah, it's all through the ranking system that's been put in place. And interestingly, it came as a certain Saudi club, Al Nassr, fell out of being able to go through because they were knocked out of the Asian Champions League. So former Juve player Cristiano Ronaldo won't be at the Club World Cup in the United States next summer, not one of the 32 teams, Al Nassr. Juve, of course, banned for those breaching of financial rules. Juve, of course, one of the big Super League clubs, and it seems we're constantly faced with sort of Super League developments. This week, what about the name? And of course, we are used to hearing the Super League name amongst many different men's and women's competitions. Women's competition in England and the men's one in Denmark.
Yeah, quite a curious, funny story there. The Danish Superliga, the league that the Danish clubs play in, they won a trademark case saying that the Super League as a trademark in the EU is theirs. Another entity, including the Super League company, the people try to launch the breakaway league, can't call their competition that. A little blow to those guys who, as we know, remain insistent on promoting their competition. So whatever it is, if one day this thing goes ahead, as far as the Danes are concerned, it cannot be called the European Super League. Any ideas for a new name, guys?
The European League Super.
Yeah.
The Duo League, because there's only, 2 teams? Real Madrid and Barcelona?
That's right. I mean, we keep going back to that scene from Monty Python.
The Classico League.
Yeah, with the image of that knight, I suppose, from Monty Python, just still sort of fighting along with just bits of him missing.
The Dream League, which I think it was a French spoof in a sort of satirical magazine that's called the Dream League, which unfortunately caught some people out.
Cracking story, Martin. Yes, La Cahiers de Foot was the magazine, and it was going to be a Qatari takeover of European football that all the clubs had secretly signed up to when were about to launch. It turned out to be a story from a chap in a bedroom in Sheffield that Nick Harris had discovered.
Yeah, he managed to spoof a load of media, so that big expectation. Do you know something? It reminds me of something, that there was a team that wasn't part of the plans that contacted someone in Qatar to ask if they knew a way to get into this Dream League.
Brilliant.
But Qatar is getting a sort of, maybe they'd see as a Dream League, they're getting an annual FIFA competition, aren't they? An annual World Cup, suddenly announced by the FIFA Council this week.
Yep, the men's under-17s World Cup, or should that be boys under-17 World Cup, 5 straight years in Qatar. That was announced by the FIFA Council all of a sudden. And the women's under-17 event, the equivalent for girls, will be held in Morocco for the same 5 straight years. So, guys, Gianni Infantino, he had said he wants to make football truly global at every occasion. We seem to have a lot of the World Cup seems to be, or FIFA's events seem to be in this one place that mainly in the Gulf, and then we've got Morocco with this, and the way it's announced. What do you think about what's just happened here?
I think we should also make clear that this is an expanded tournament, so 48 teams for the men's, 24 for the women's. And, I think countries really do like having these junior tournaments. That some of the countries can never dream of hosting the actual senior tournaments. I think, these has been really a really positive thing. But and also to change it from a biennial thing to an annual thing, it just, I'm not quite sure what the reasoning behind that is. And I mean, is it fair to say that Qatar and Morocco are amongst the sort of countries which are, most supportive of Gianni Infantino?
We talk about Qatar a lot, but let's just look at Morocco. In terms of CAF and the African continent, the Moroccan Federation is arguably the most powerful. Fawzi Lekjaa, the president, he sits on the FIFA Council as well. And he has a lot of influence, and very close to the FIFA president and the FIFA hierarchy. And is this the way things go? They just announce these things behind closed doors, and we move on, just like the Saudi announcement a few months ago for 2034 and the 2030 World Cup too.
And without any form of press conference, only Insta videos by Gianni Infantino explaining it, so all in-house. The only explanation we got was on a FIFA press release, which said that the decisions followed a global call for expressions of interest in hosting both competitions, with a focus on leveraging the use of existing footballing infrastructure in the interest of tournament efficiencies and sustainability. So, who were the rivals from? How did they assess the other bids? Who else was interested?
Yeah, again, we won't know that because we can't ask these questions. And just to go back, we've said this before. This was decided at a FIFA council. These are these quarterly meetings of the 36-member board of FIFA, essentially. And in the past, as we all know, there was a press conference after each of them to explain this. However fraught the environment around FIFA or the FIFA president at the time, there would be these events for a conversation. The lack of that creates uncertainty and doubt over why decisions are made.
I mean, I do think it is good that they've got all these World Cup stadiums in 2022 and that they are going to be used, but I'm not sure 5 years in a row is necessary.
No, and also there's other countries that have got World Cup stadiums that have a poor legacy. You can go back to South Africa in 2010, those empty stadiums, Brazil in 2014. Qatar isn't the only one that has built these arenas. And, if you were to ask FIFA, maybe they will say 48 teams is a lot, and there is a cost to these things, and only a few countries could host such events. But as we've seen, they found creative ways out of this with those multi-continent World Cups.
But there are other issues to factor in, of course, around an under-17s World Cup, that you are facing safeguarding issues. So you have got young players, so you need an environment that's going to be safe for them. You need to have the infrastructure for them to be able to stay closely, to be watched and have the right monitoring in place and protection. So perhaps going to the same country might be beneficial, going to places that rather than having to run safeguarding checks on different parts of the world that you might be less familiar with hosting events. Although perhaps these were the types of things you'd explain if there was a press conference.
Well, yeah, and also, Rob, to your point there, isn't that FIFA's job to actually improve the ability of these countries to be football nations? It's the job of FIFA. So these things, by hosting these events, maybe FIFA could help these countries develop their footballing infrastructure. But again, conversations that we could maybe one day have with them.
Press release talks about the council supporting Infantino's call to impose stricter measures and increase the commitments of anyone involved in the global football to fight racism by including an item on the Congress agenda that will tackle this unacceptable scourge on the game. It's been many months since Infantino announced this. No real chance to hear any more details yet, although they will say they're working towards Bangkok and the Congress in May.
Yeah, but we all await the item on the Congress agenda. whenever that will be. But I mean, I think it's tackling racism is one of the biggest challenges for football and FIFA. But I think unless you do it properly, you shouldn't actually be wanting to go into these jobs. It's one of these things that has to be addressed, and if you don't make it a priority and give resources and do it properly, then you shouldn't be in those jobs.
Also, is there not a risk here of over promising and under delivering as well? Because for people at the receiving end of racist abuse, it's a an awful experience. And now you have the top man in international football saying, we are committed, we're going to do something. Just wait until you see what we do in Bangkok. Now, it can't just be a statement that everyone agrees to. It has to be actionable, something actionable, and something that has teeth. But we have had no signs what that actually looks like. So a lot of pressure now to deliver.
It's not just about responding when there is an incident of abuse. It's about multicultural diversity of conversation around FIFA and promotion of religion and how you're discussing religion. I mean, there hasn't been, I would say, a lot of talk about the start of Ramadan, which was officially declared this week. We hear a lot in English football about breaks in matches, about events being held, but there's sort of less visibility at the sort of top end of football, particularly for something that is so notable for many, many people around the world and goes on for a month.
Yeah, I guess more as football has become more internationalized, certainly at European club level, you have a lot of Muslim players who are playing in the top clubs. So that visibility almost just has become natural because some of the best players are practicing Muslims and are fasting during the month. So we see that, but perhaps from a FIFA point of view, I'm not sure what they're supposed to do. I guess it's just one of the world's big religions.
FIFA obviously working towards a big item on racism at the Congress in Bangkok, but other forms of discrimination too. Concerns across the global game. Often not much action, but certainly in Austria this week, some tough punishment on homophobia.
Yeah. It's really interesting. Ralf Rangnick, he had a short spell as the coach of Manchester United, an unsuccessful one. He then has become the coach of Austria, and he's left 3 players out of his squad for the March friendlies after they were involved in homophobic chanting following the Vienna derby. These were 3 Rapid Vienna players, Guido Bergstaller, Marco Gruhl, and Nicholas Hedl. And he said, look, they can't be picked. They must seriously address this issue and understand what it means for people when they're publicly insulted and discriminated against such a way. This is something I will not tolerate in my team. It's quite a strong move, bold move, and perhaps the correct move from a national team manager. It's really important, isn't it?
I suppose this is what zero tolerance looks like in action, particularly when this wasn't something enforced on him by a ban being put in place, but choosing to take a moral decision to weaken his own team.
I think it's quite a good move. I mean, he said it's not a permanent exclusion, isn't he? So, I mean, I think it's something which, if you're the player, then I don't think you can expect when that becomes public for there not to be some sort of action like this against you. So, I think they get also told they've got to attend some equality workshops. I think that's a good move too.
Yeah, it can often, I think, help in issues of discrimination and racism for some sort of face-to-face learnings. It's the way of confronting the issues, and certainly education, which is something Infantino does talk about. We have mentioned sort of player welfare early in relation to things like under-17s tournaments at FIFA, and it's something being discussed particularly in football this week in the women's game in England with the Chelsea manager Emma Hayes. This not regarding minors, but actually just how things work in dressing rooms when you've got things that are actually your abuse of power, if it's a player-coach relationship, but then just generally player relationships in the same team.
Yeah, I thought this quite an interesting story. I think the Times ran it on the back page, basically saying romantic relationships between teammates aren't appropriate. They're a challenge to coaches. It follows the Leicester City's women's team manager Willie Kirk being suspended for allegedly having a relationship with a player. So
no word from Willie Kirk himself on that.
No, not so far. The club has said he's assisting the club with an internal process. But yeah, Hayes, I thought she spoke very well about it. She says it is a challenge, and it's part of the fact coming from an amateur game to a professional game. She thinks player coach and player to player relationships are inappropriate, and this is something as the women's game becomes more professional, they're going to have to deal with.
Yeah, and it's very common as well. So it will be a journey for the women's game in terms of there's very famous player relationships at the very top of the game there, and you can imagine in a dressing room the kind of tension. A lot of workplaces as well. You have kind of rules and in terms of reporting, etc. to whoever runs your HR, but in terms of a dressing room, that dynamic is very, very sensitive in professional sport. And then when it comes to the transfer market as well, we've seen players having to move together to different countries if your partner is gone. That is a very different and difficult dynamic for coaches, as Emma Hayes was saying, to have to manage.
Yeah, and certainly showing again why Emma Hayes is such a voice within the game, able to sort of discuss these bigger issues and tackle the more complex issues facing the game as she prepares to head to the United States, of course, to manage the US women's national team. Although her first main gig will be in Paris at the Olympics after finishing the season with Chelsea. And also a big issue in terms of the integrity of the game, of course, match fixing. And just this week, the Brazilian Senate opening an inquiry into fixing in the top division. So certainly that'll be something to watch as well. Sport Radar, it's watched 109 matches played in Brazil in 2023 under suspicion of fixing. So that's going to be one to watch. But moving away from football, and we don't often talk basketball, we don't often talk Burundi, Tariq.
No, Burundi is in the news, certainly when it comes to basketball this week. The top league in Africa, the Basketball Africa League, it has backing from the NBA in the United States, but it also has a sponsorship with Visit Rwanda. Football fans will see that sponsorship on the shirt of Arsenal in the Premier League, Paris Saint-Germain in France, but also it is one of the title sponsors of the league there, and there is a Visit Rwanda patch on each of the teams. The Burundian representatives to the competition were refused to play with that patch on. In the first game, they taped over it. They got sanctioned for that. And in the end, they had to withdraw from the tournament. This is because of a conflict between Burundi and Rwanda. Now, imagine that, in the Champions League, for example, in football, a team refusing to wear a logo because their government have told them we can't be promoting this sort of thing. It raises for me all sorts of questions when you have government sponsorship. We've got Aramco from Saudi Arabia coming in, we've got Emirates Airlines everywhere, Qatar Airways. Guys, this is the first time I've seen something like this, but there is potential if countries start falling out with each other and you have nation states sponsoring events. Gazprom, for example, guys.
Yeah, I was thinking about Gazprom. That would have been a classic one because after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, Gazprom heavily into sports sponsorship, and I mean UEFA had to drop them. But I think if they hadn't, and if Gazprom had continued as sponsors, I think you could have easily seen that same situation arising.
Yeah, also, I mean, one of the players on the Burundian team, he actually spoke out against the decision of this team to withdraw. I think it's a guy called Brighton Hobbs. He's an American guard. He went on Instagram Live and he said, the government told our club president that we can't play. So we told the African Basketball League that we have to forfeit our games because we blocked out the Visit Rwanda thing. He then says, my thing is, we knew what we were getting into coming into the league. People had signed contracts with the sponsors in the contracts and stuff like that, so they knew what they were getting themselves into. Well, did they? Because perhaps at the time of that signing, the relationships between Burundi and Rwanda might not have been bad, or as severe as they are now. It just tells you what happens when the political tides change on a global level. FIFA, for example, has nation state backed sponsors. What happens then?
And something that might not seem a sports story to start with, which developed this week in the UK, but it involves the Manchester City owner Sheikh Mansour effectively being banned from buying Britain's Daily Telegraph.
Yeah, legislation being brought in to ban foreign state ownership of the media. I think the interesting thing here is that the government is effectively viewing Sheikh Mansour, who's the Deputy Prime Minister of the UAE, as effectively being state ownership. Now, Manchester City have always insisted that they're not state owned, but it appears the government says that they are. And also, interestingly, with the new independent regulator about to come in, they've said they're not going to do anything to stop foreign states owning football clubs because they don't want to get involved in foreign policy. So it does seem like a sort of, taking different approaches to the what is some people might say the same issue.
Because it was the point made by Martyn who tweets under the handle Ugly Game, who pointed out, intrigued to see how the government now believes it is inappropriate for nation states to be allowed to buy British companies for the purpose of influencing public opinion. I look forward to this principle being reflected in the long-promised football reform bill, because you can now use a sports entity like a media outlet to influence, can't you?
Well, it's not only that, guys. I mean, you have to be blind to see the impact of state ownership on the fan base of those clubs. If you want to see influencing of opinion, you just had to go to Newcastle the day after the Saudi Arabian takeover took place, and the same kind of messaging from some Manchester City fans around the UAE, beyond owners of football teams. They've been talking about the UAE and the leadership there, and sometimes in a defensive way. These are people who wouldn't naturally be talking about this subject had their teams not be owned by them. So that's the question I have for you. When we're talking about shaping public opinion, these football clubs shape the opinions of millions of people. People follow them in such a passionate way. What's the line?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one. I mean, people who defend the sort of state ownerships of football clubs say, well, hang on, the UK does so much business with Qatar, Saudi Arabia, whoever, UAE generally. Why should football clubs be any different to any other businesses? But there are differences, and there are differences with newspapers. The government have decided.
Just a question of public opinion, Martyn. It's interesting that those defenders would say Britain, and they do a lot of business. But if you own, I don't know, a chocolate manufacturer in Birmingham, that doesn't attract millions of people, cheering on the owners of the chocolate manufacturer in the same way a football club has an effect on opinion. And obviously newspapers shape public opinion in a different way.
And we are still waiting to see just what will happen with the football regulator, which is yet to actually be brought in England. We're expecting the government's legislation to come forward with that, especially it's something being demanded by the EFL, which runs the 3 leagues below the Premier League, because they haven't got the cash they want from the Premier League. The Premier League clubs can't agree to the funding. And of course, all this against the backdrop of the unresolved Premier League case into Manchester City and those 115 charges. And it's often discussed, isn't it? How do you bring up the charges amongst City's progress to titles? It can be excluded from many match reports or even analyses of how City are progressing in print publications, on radio and TV, with many choosing just to praise Pep and overlook perhaps the funding of how the team was assembled, which obviously City are pushing back against the Premier League case, against any wrongdoing in terms of the raising of the money from Abu Dhabi to comply with financial fair play. But certainly it is an unresolved matter. But it was brought up this week.
Yeah, I thought, it was Ian Wright, the former Arsenal striker, now a broadcaster. I thought he did it quite deftly as well. And to your point, when do you bring it up? He brought it up in a very specific moment, because this was a talk on Sky Sports in the UK about Pep Guardiola's legacy and Jurgen Klopp, his great rival at Liverpool, and how they'll be remembered. And Ian writes that if we're going to be counting the looking at the legacy, and Pep has built this great team with great players and incredible football, but you must talk about the elephant in the room. By that, he meant the 115 charges. And he said, until that's resolved, in a way, it's unfair on the players at Man City and Pep Guardiola that this thing hangs over them without resolution. And he's got a point, hasn't he? You know, these people have done an incredible job, and there's a risk of all of that potentially being overshadowed while this kind of smell, this murkiness hangs over it all.
And how much does this unresolved case hang over Premier League decisions as the 20 clubs get together to try to make decisions? I mean, you know, clubs who are hoping for some sort of resolution of this, they can't be happy with the fact it's going on.
No, I think they can't. But, you know, we had Richard Masters saying in Parliament the other day that a date has been fixed for the hearing, but he can't say when it is or where it is. So everyone's still in the dark.
Not the only challenge for the Premier League. They're yet to agree this funding arrangement for the EFL. We mentioned football regulation. The EFL demanding that the British government step in and create this regulator for English football, which could enforce a payment agreement. They want a lot of cash. The Premier League think, they're giving enough already, but it's not what Richard Masters wants. It's getting an agreement from his 20 clubs and basically needing 14 to approve, isn't it? Yeah,
this is a sort of pretty bad defeat, really, although there was no vote, because I think they realised there wasn't going to be enough support for a vote. So the Premier League clubs, they met this week. Those who opposed giving money to the EFL basically just weren't going to be moved. So I think the Premier League had told the government on several occasions that they were very close to getting this through, and I think a pretty big disappointment, and it's sort of back to the drawing board. They're going to draw up their own new financial controls first, so we're months away probably from anything happening.
We did hear from one Premier League club, didn't we? Their financial results, the half-year financial results, the second quarter, which featured finally the sale of that stake of 27.7% of the club to Sir Jim Ratcliffe. And some of the figures harder to read because a year earlier it was during the Qatar World Cup, so there were fewer matches. So we do see, don't we, a revenue increase. United, of course, were back in the Champions League, although knocked out in the group stage. But it's some of the sponsorship detail which caught your eye, Martyn.
Yeah, so the new Adidas deal is saying that every time Manchester City fails to qualify for the Champions League, they will get a £10 million penalty. The deal's worth $90 million a season, so that's a sort of fairly big hit. Now, what the arrangement has been until now is that any penalty clause doesn't kick in unless they don't qualify for 2 consecutive seasons. That's not happened since 2015 when the Adidas deal was drawn up. But now it's going to be very expensive, costly if United don't make the elite competition in the future.
It'll be one interesting one to watch there. There's another big sponsorship story with football. FC Barcelona, probably with Manchester United and Real Madrid in terms of interest. Their shirt is on the market now. Long-time relationship with Nike, but that might be under threat. They're looking for 100 million euros. Juan Laporta, the president, someone not afraid to make kind of outlandish statements, said recently that they might go without a sponsor and start making their own jerseys. They've discounted that. It now looks like a two-way fight between Nike to retain it and Puma. So that's an interesting one to watch, and similar values to Manchester United. Both in the market at the same time. I wonder if it makes a difference when you got these two big giants in the market at exactly the same time.
Particularly as there's some folks on how committed Nike are to some parts of sports deals, how much funding there is, various endorsements that have fallen by the way. So that's certainly going to be one that's going to be developing as they try to jostle for the cash. We mentioned at the start, Tariq, you're at the WADA Symposium. So what was actually discovered? This is Olympic year, often going into games. Everyone will say, well, we certainly had this in 2012. It'll be the cleanest games ever. That was discovered then later on to be corrupted by Russia's doping scheme. So what were the big themes that WADA were discussing?
Yeah, symposium. We don't use that word that often. I think it was a meeting. About 1,000 people, quite a big one. So all over the world, the various representatives of the anti-doping movement to talk about developments in the anti-doping space. One of the biggest points WADA were trying to get across was the work of their investigations team that was launched after the Russian scandal. So this former German policeman Gunther Younger has been heading this team since 2016, and they were promoting their work with law enforcement around Europe, particularly cracking down on labs that produce these prohibited substances and tons of these pills being captured, etc. But I was left under the impression is that WADA's work, because a lot of these pills go to people in the gym, people who want to like bulk up. I don't know if the World Anti-Doping Agency, with a budget of just 50 million and trying to catch elite level doping, I'm not sure that's what they're founded for, but that's what they were pushing. And they also delivered an award to Thomas Bach, celebrating WADA's 25th anniversary. It's gave a load of clean sports trophies out. The first recipient, Thomas Bach, the IOC president. IOC funds half of WADA, of course.
We know with the Oscars are preceded by the Razzies, aren't they? The Raspberry Awards for those perhaps produced the worst films. Was there a Dirty Sport Award as well, the dirtiest in sport? Well,
the Russian delegation, I didn't really see them in play. However, Russia was on the agenda. Martyn will speak a bit about this as well, because of the recent case involving the then 15-year-old ice skater Valieva at the Beijing Olympics. Martyn, you had some more detail on that case, didn't you, this week?
Yeah, so Kamila Valieva, I think 15 when she tested positive after she had been brilliant at the Beijing Olympics, and then this positive test news came through, and then everything went pear-shaped for her. But she was banned for 4 years in January. But it just looking at the full findings of the judgment of the Court of Arbitration for Sport shows that in terms of non-prohibited substances, she was given 56 different medications between the ages of 13 and 15. And I spoke to Travis Tigert, the US anti-doping chief, who said that was sickening. Oliver Nigley, the WADA Director General, said it was shocking. And both people said, actually, what is very unfortunate about this is actually the entourages, the coaches, the medical doctors have got off scot-free. They're continuing to work. The next generation of Russian ice skaters, nothing's happened to them. I mean, Nigley made the point that the investigations have been hampered by the fact no one can go into Russia at the moment. But it does seem that, Valieva is the person who's sort of, I think Nigley described it as she's been sacrificed.
Yeah, and so much does come down to the support staff. How liable should a teenager be for potentially being manipulated by a system, and particularly when you're trying to make an impression, grow in a sport, and you are told to sort of follow instructions. Although, you can be more worldly now given the internet to search things up, but you do put your faith in coaches and support staff. It is an ongoing issue in terms of just how much you punish those teenagers and how much of a route you give them back into their sport.
Well, that was what the effort to clear Kamila Valieva was, that she was a minor. These are children as well, obviously, and in terms of you kind of are under the authority of these adults. It's a type of abuse if you think about it. 56 different potions. It makes you wonder, like, is this, because this case has come out and we can see them written down, is this normal? Is that, because they're not prohibitive substances. She wouldn't have been dinged for those. These are presumably 50 of those 56 maybe she's allowed to have. Is this what athletes are doing across the board then?
Well, I think Oliver Nigley said it's not unusual for elite athletes to have quite a few of these sort of non-prohibitive medications, because there is this sort of medicalization of sport, and people trying to get an advantage by taking non-banned things, which might increase your energy, your blood flow, your muscles. So, but I think he said he had never seen so many. And certainly not for somebody who's was 13 when she started taking them. And the things that we're talking creatine, amino acid based muscle boosting supplements, heart medications. I think it basically is tantamount to abuse.
Yeah, it does seem to be one of those things that should be a priority for sports. Again, the issue of welfare that comes up. We do end on a lighter note, something that I've been reporting on. It is the lighter side of sports. I was in Paris the other week and did get a chance to go around the Olympic Village as the IOC Commission was making its final checks on the accommodation. We checked out the bedrooms, cardboard beds again, as we used in Tokyo. Apparently they can support 250 kilograms. And I was asking about that Tokyo pandemic era sex ban. Intimacy is allowed again. They are encouraging athletes to mix. And I did ask one of those perennial Olympic Village questions. And I got the first answer, I think, for Paris. 9,000 athletes, and there will be 300,000 condoms.
That is front page news of a red top newspaper there you got there, Rob. Well done.
It's usually the swimmers. I remember they're the ones who cause havoc in the village because their events finish earlier than everyone else. That's the thing to look at as well, to see what happens, the schedule, and see who's going to be partying first.
But no champagne in the Olympic Village, I was told.
In France, that is a disgrace.
Yeah, they're one of the sponsors.
Is there an official Olympic sponsor of champagne?
LVMH is one of the biggest sponsors of the Olympics. They own the biggest champagne brand.
You would know that. You've got classy taste. There is a first beer sponsor, of course, as well for the IOC this time.
Can you just go back to the thing about the condoms, Rob? Do you say there's 900,000 condoms?
300,000.
300,000 condoms. Okay. And for 10,000 athletes.
I have already done the math.
How many condoms per athlete per day?
It's almost around 2 per day for the duration of the games.
Very safe environment there.
Are they going to be doing any actual competition?
Well, that's the thing. Safe and secure games is often the mantra of the IOC.
The Olympic bubble.
Everything well prepared. Well, that about brings an end to this week's episode of Sports Unlocked. As ever, you can message us at Sport Unlocked on X, Facebook and Instagram. And if you hit subscribe, you land in your feeds automatically. But for now, thank you for listening. Goodbye.